Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time you are listening to this. Welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. If you have been following on, I'm sorry for the break. We had a little bit of a pause, but we're back. We're back here on chapter 9. Chapter 9 is entitled Work. We are going through the book Pages to Progress. I'm going to ask maybe John if you could hold up the book so that people can see what book we're walking through. This is called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction by Eugene H. Peterson. There's two versions, as you can see. There's the newer version and the older version. They're both pretty much the same thing. I think the prefaces are different on both books. But the long and short of it, we're essentially walking through the Psalms. And we've got a lot to learn on our ascent to the Psalms, because this is essentially the journey where people were on their way pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Today, chapter 9, work. We're in Psalms 127. Maybe I'll ask James, would you mind reading this psalm for me as Eugene Peterson has put together for our conversation today?
Uh, Psalms 127. If God doesn't build the house, the builders only build shacks. If God doesn't guard the city, the night watchman might as well nap. It's useless to rise early and go to bed late and work your worried fingers to the bone. Don't you know he enjoys giving rest to those he loves? Don't you see that children are God's best gift, the fruit of the womb, his generous legacy? Like a warrior's fistful of arrows are the children of a vigorous youth. Oh, how blessed are you, parents, with your quivers full of children. Your enemies don't stand a chance against you. You'll sweep them right off your doorstep. Psalms 127.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are going to dive into the concept of work. Eugene Peterson kind of uh, goes into detail with this psalm, and hopefully we can try and have some good takeaways from each of our readings. We will have our own perspectives, our own things that we bring to the table. Let's start with this. So one of the things that I noticed that Eugene Peterson does is he compares Western culture to Eastern culture. He compares the notion of there is a way that Western culture defines work, a symbol, if you were, or a characterization of work. And that, far as I understood it to be, was the concept of the machine or the symbol of the machine. The notion that a machine controls you. He gives an example of technology, and technology is out there to try and literally take control, supposedly with the notion of trying to make work easier for us. But the idea of the machine I resonated with as a Westerner growing up in Western society. Work has constantly been one of those things where I'm on the grind, I'm on the clock. There are deadlines, there are things that I have to do constantly in order to keep on track. And I, in essence, find myself in many instances at mercy to some of the machines that have been created. But I wanted to ask the question to each of you: have any of you experienced work in that same Western descriptive way that Eugene Peterson? Is a machine an accurate way to describe it for you, or is it not? Is there other things that have been more resonant with you? So how have you defined work for yourself is my first question. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I mean, the saying is often you're a cog in the wheel. And, you know, I'm hospital employed now, so it's a lot different than when I was in private practice. James might, I don't know if you're in private practice or hospital employed, but you lose a lot of your ability to just make decisions and do things the way you want to when you're part of a bigger system. You have to get approvals, and sometimes you get approval and sometimes you get denial.
Mm. Is that true for you,
And
James?
Yes, absolutely. I when you asked that question, I thought of a book I read in med school at Loma Linda. It was probably one of the more memorable books and formative books I've read. I can't remember the exact name and author, but the premise was that um, it challenged one to consider one's line of work, um, as not just another job or occupation, but as a calling.
Hmm.
And that
That
stuck
was
with
in your
me
med
ever
school book?
since. Well, this was during a medical ethics class.
Hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in our little religious elective
Got it.
segment.
Got it. Got it. Got
Uh,
it. I assume that's probably quite unique to a Christian institution, right?
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of doctors, I mean, there's better ways to make money. And so I think a lot of doctors, at least initially, are in the business of taking care of patients
Hmm.
to help patients get better.
Hmm.
I think a lot of it initially is fairly idealistic, and it should be that way. It should be a calling.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know if it's the same book, but we kind of get that repetitively. But it's interesting because I'm going into 20 years of practice now, and there has been in the last couple years a huge shift to productivity is a word they use, and they actually literally keep track of patients you're seeing and RVUs, revenue volume units that you're able to achieve, and then capacity,
Hmm.
how efficient are you? And it's very much become more of a business,
Hmm.
and I think it's in a lot of ways taken away from it, you know, the reason we all initially got into it. But
Right.
it is also very Western. It's like you said, all these things we do are to improve the efficiency. And I think the idea initially was, oh yeah, you're going to get more efficient, and then you're going to have this more time in your life to not. But I certainly haven't experienced that. It just seems like you're working even more.
Yeah, I get that. I resonate with a lot of that. I wonder, I can certainly say for me, the world of work has very often encroached upon my identity as a person.
mhm.
Um, has that been for you, D, in your world of work and your experience of work? Where do you see work
No, I
identified?
mean, for me, as far as work and identity goes, they're two separate beings. I've never, I never thought I am not this title that I have at workplace. I am still me as a person first, and then I have this title at work. I don't derive like um, self-esteem or anything from my work. I enjoy the work for what it is, but it's two separate things. But like this part, it's talking about the comparing Western and Eastern culture, whereas Western culture is talking a lot about the human effort, right? All putting all that our energy and everything into this work, whereas the Eastern culture, it talks about the Buddha kind of sitting back and pulling back and almost
To
like
quote him, a fat person sitting cross-legged looking down at his own
yeah,
navel.
yeah, it seems like they put all human effort out of it.
Mm,
But even then I feel like that's sort of like pseudo human effort that they still put into it.
mm,
um but I think work, I think unless you enjoy doing what you do, it's such a dread. I mean, really.
mm.
So yeah, I mean, I took 2 years off out of my work, right? And I just returned back to work, and I'm so enjoying the
Well,
work.
you got itchy fingers in your 2 years, didn't you? You wanted to get back to work.
Yes, I'm so enjoying it. I'm so happy that I'm back working. Um, but there are, like John talked about, like this productivity, right? Everything is about productivity and being efficient. And that, if I let myself like get caught up in that, oh, it takes all the joy out of it.
Mm.
Ugh.
But our world
It
is run
does.
by metrics in the
It
West.
does.
It
Mhm.
runs with productivity metrics, results driven.
Yeah.
All these kinds of things are used in reviews as you sit before managers and people. They want to see tangible reasons to keep you and to and to and to validate your experience as a worker. I guess my job is maybe a little bit different in some respects as a pastor, but I'll share my experience and say, unfortunately, I feel like my identity has kind of connected with my job in many different ways. I say unfortunately because uh, who I am is not a pastor. Who I am is not often really experienced as often as what I do. And I find that for me personally, I teeter the line between the both. Now, obviously, I try my best to live an authentic life, and I try my best to do that. I find, however, that because of my job, I live versions of my life that are present for the community that I serve, which is great and it's wonderful. I love this community. But sometimes I just need a space not to be Pastor Sam. And that's quite present. I think Eugene Peterson talks about the extremities of both worlds. The extremities of the Eastern world is do nothing. Look within yourself and you'll find meaning. Literally do nothing until you're motionless. And I don't know if a Buddhist was reading this or someone who follows some of the Eastern practices, they would probably critique his work in saying that this is quite extreme. This is not all it's about. There's so much more than just doing nothing and moving away from work. I think, however, there is a healthy and happy medium that I reckon the Bible strongly talks about. Here's the evidence of what I say. It's the creation of the Sabbath. It's the notion that God legitimately worked and taught us to follow this model of work. And at the same time, God legitimately taught us to stop working and to rest and to be introspective. And he didn't talk about the Sabbath at all in this chapter, which I was a little bit peeved by, because I was just like, it's so relevant. It's so relevant to talk about the balance. You know, he talks about the Eastern practice. Well, the concept of rest and the concept of pulling away is so what's the word? Important to understand work. And I know that's just my perspective. What do you guys think? Do you resonate with that? Was there something else that kind of
No,
brought
I mean, I
or
like the idea
brought
of
up?
Sabbath. Two things. One is, we're Seventh-day Adventists.
Mm,
And I think you're right. He is talking about extremes. I mean, he talks about the Tower of Babel
mm-hmm,
back in the day and kind of equates it with the Western culture
mm,
where it wasn't a healthy approach. But then he also talks about Thessalonia where everyone's just like, oh, we don't need to do anything.
mm,
He kind of equates that with the Eastern culture and Buddha, but even as Seventh-day Adventists, in 1844 or whatever, there were literally Adventists, they were selling everything off and just
yep,
living off of what they earned. And then all of a sudden, nothing happened,
mm-hmm,
at least here on Earth. And they kind of became a laughing stock.
mm,
But again, and we still see people like that. They just they're almost parasitic in how, they take advantage of the resources available to them and wider community, even a smaller community with the church. I mean, we get people coming through and they got needs and we try to help them out and then they just kind of move on.
mm,
And I think that in a lot of ways, just their lifestyle. But I think he very masterfully goes from, what you initially brought up, the Western culture, Eastern culture. The next paragraph, he says there is another option and
mm,
he uses Psalms 27. And yeah, he didn't talk about the Sabbath, but he did talk about God and creation and how God actually works.
mm-hmm,
And it's interesting because he basically makes it sound like, God's work is effortless.
mm,
And I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but I think it goes back to what Dee said. If you really enjoy your work, it does feel effortless. I mean,
mm,
a lot of times the stress in work is the stress that we as a society put on ourselves.
definitely. What about you, James? Do you resonate with that?
Yes, yes. Going back to your mention of the Sabbath, so I've been watching this documentary about quarterbacks, and
Oh,
It was
I heard
interesting.
about it. I don't.
Cousins, you heard about it? It's on Netflix, but it's directed by Peyton Manning. But Cousins, who is a veteran quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings, does something very unusual, and I really respected him for that. He takes every single Tuesday totally off from football. And that's very unusual because all his other teammates, other quarterbacks are training every day, they're in the field. But he takes this one Tuesday every week and just does everything, quality time with his family and basically getting in touch with the important things in life
So he
to
takes a
him.
Sabbath,
I guess
Essentially.
hits his Sabbath, yeah. But I really respected that because in some sense it really conveys where his true values are. I
mm,
mean, football is super important to him because I mean he really wants to win the ultimate trophy, the Lombardi Trophy, the Super Bowl, and he hasn't. And so most quarterbacks and people in his position are going to do everything possible. They're going to put the work in and day out to excel. For someone like of his caliber to do that, yeah, it really tells me that to him there are more important things in life. And he actually happens to be a Christian, but um, and so I guess what I think about all of this is I know that Peterson mentions also, as people well know, that Paul, the disciple Paul, I think he definitely worked super hard. If looking
Mhm.
just from an objective point of view, probably harder than most people, most Christians that I've known.
mm,
Um, but that was not the end point in him that made him work that hard.
right.
I always notice that even in my life, if I have a purpose um, or someone that I'm doing something for that I respect or admire, that maybe I follow as my leader, and they tell me to do something, then I would wholeheartedly do the work with no qualms, and it becomes almost effortless
Mm,
because you have a purpose, you have a drive, you have a reason for it.
hmm
And I think that Psalms 127 is telling us that it's not telling us not to work, it's not telling us to overwork, but it's telling us, work is a blessing, work is good, work is what God does himself, but we must have God in mind um, in that work, whatever that work is.
mm. Yeah, I got that too. I want to share a quote on page 103, I think, which resonates what you're talking about, James, a little bit. Um, the curse of some people's lives is not work as such, but senseless work, vain work,
Mhm.
futile work, work that takes place apart from God, and work that ignores the if. When he says ignores the if, he's actually referring to a point in the Psalms at the beginning where it says, if God doesn't build the house, the builders only build shacks, which essentially the meaning, the essence of what he's trying to communicate, or the psalmist is trying to communicate, is that unless God is actually a part of the direction, um, it's difficult to gain some kind of quality in how you work, and meaning, should I say, in how you work. I think we've all probably done some kind of job, paid or unpaid, where you're just doing it because you're just doing it, versus you've done something where you're doing it because you know you're part of a wider mission, which is governed by God and led by. There's a difference. There's a difference in trying to do something because you know that I'm contributing to something bigger than myself. In our case, it would be God's mission for humanity, and that's something that really came out for me. Dee, was there anything that you wanted to add, or a quote, or something, a thought that you wanted to bring out from reading this chapter?
I think it's on the next page
Mm,
where it talks about work um, being a relationship,
mm.
Mhm.
you
I
know.
highlighted that too.
Mhm. It's on page 105. It says, the personal relationship that we create and develop in the work.
Hmm
And, I think this is very true. because our society, um, let's say, for example, like John was talking about, because I know that, especially for physicians, it has really moved away from relationship to productivity. You have a set number of minutes that you have to see patients and go from patient to patient. And it's very, very difficult, even as me as a patient, to develop really any relationship with the physicians these days, my primary care physician.
Mm.
And I feel bad for the physicians because they can't really do that. Because again, like your work would be so much more meaningful and so much more like you would derive so much more joy from it when you have developed that relationship rather than it's just numbered that you have to go through.
Mm.
So, I mean,
Yep.
same thing for me in my work, but yeah.
Mm. Any other quotes that we want to share? I have loads, so if you don't share, I will share.
Well, I mean, you could take a number of directions with this psalm, obviously. And Peterson obviously is leading us down this road of work. But it's interesting because he basically says work should be as easy and comfortable as procreation.
Yeah, that was interesting.
And I kind of laugh because I think it's always, I mean, having kids wasn't effortless. It was work, and there were good times and bad times. But I think, it is a very natural
I think he's talking about the
part
act of making children.
of
Yeah, that's what I'm
life.
thinking.
And I think what he's getting at is that work with Christ as the center, no matter what your work is or where your work is,
Hmm.
will be a lot more natural and and more godly as a result. And I think
Mm.
what he's getting at is that people are going to notice that, and you'll be able to do more than, as a
Mm.
physician, just helping them get better, physically. You'll be able to help them hopefully get better mentally and spiritually
Well,
as well.
as bold as that illustration was, this is how I
Mhm.
passed it at least. Passed it at least. It was very much down the line of, well, if sex with your spouse is work, you have a problem.
Oh
You
yeah.
have a you have a problem. And and I think that the Bible writers knew, David knew exactly why he said what he said,
Mhm.
because at the end of the day, there are certain things that should be just the joy of being in relationship, and out of that comes still a contribution to the wider mission that God is leading us to. And I also laughed when he used that illustration because, I think that what he was essentially trying to say is that God is inviting you into the mission that is enjoyable, pleasing, that is satisfying, all of those things that are related to the relationship. I think about youngsters who are thinking about future careers. What do they want to be? And, you know, I find it is very hard to guide young people into future professions when they don't have a relationship with God because they don't quite know how it's going to fit in the wider contribution. I think it starts off with them, yeah, I want to do something because I think I like it, or I think it's cool, or it's going to make me a lot of money. Um, and I guess that has its place, but the older that I've got, the more existential I've become in terms of thinking, well, what is going to actually give me fulfillment, and what is actually going to get me up in the morning and go. Um, and I and those are some of the questions that I've been wrestling with as I've got older and older and older. I want to make sure that I wake up every day and I'm not only contributing to a wider mission, but I genuinely feel like I'm in this. God has placed me here to be as a part of a massive number of contributors that will help the human race move forward. At least that's my grand picture of what I see. What are some of the final takeaways or thoughts that you got from this particular chapter that you're going to walk away with? Who wants to go first with that one?
So I was just thinking, I mean, work is a blessing. Obviously, it's different now than I think it was in Jesus's time, which is also different from how it was originally set up before sin in the
Mm,
Garden of Eden. I mean, work was a way to enjoy relationship with those around you. It was also a way to provide means, food, and and things have changed a lot. I mean, right now, people don't think in terms of food.
mm,
You think in terms of more, money, I think, unless you don't have money, and then all of a sudden you're back to thinking about food. But back to what I originally said, I think, work is a blessing.
mm,
And I think there will be a day when there is no sin and we will be in a new earth. And that's what I don't like about this idea. Well, Jesus comes and we all go to heaven.
mm-hmm.
And I'm just like,
Sit on
sarcastically,
clouds and play
like, yeah,
harps.
exactly what I was going to say. I mean, no, that's not what happens. You're back here on earth. You got something to do, and it's
Mm,
called work or whatever you want to call it. But
mm,
it's basically something that's going to keep you busy, hopefully with a little bit better balance and a little bit better
mm.
ability to enjoy it and be able to be more successful at it than we are right now.
And without the PTSD of what we think of when we think of work
Exactly.
in the here and now. Yeah, I resonate with that totally. Dee, have you got any takeaways or any thoughts that you're walking away with from this chapter?
I think for most of us, it's difficult to picture God working.
Mm,
I mean, he is working,
mm.
not like he's, on his back and not doing anything, but it's hard for
We
us to
certainly don't
picture
see it
what,
the way humans see it. Yeah.
yeah, 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 like what exactly is he doing,
Mm,
right? But I think that recently I don't exactly recall where I read it from, but it was talking about how God's, talking about God's protection.
mm,
And he is at every minute of working things out, um, and directing the angels, if you will, and just keeping all of us, providing us with protection.
mm.
So um, yeah, it just I mean, reading that was good for me in that I was really again able to see, yeah, God is actually actively involved and engaged, with us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that. James?
Just to add, I think um, I used to think that only pastors or evangelists could minister and do God's work, but this book does reinforce that you can minister and do God's work in any line of work. I
Mm,
mean,
Totally.
not just medical or dental or health fields, very helping kind of altruistic professions, but any line of work. And I really like page 105, he says, as Christians do the jobs and tasks assigned to them and what the world calls work, we learn to pay attention to and practice what God is doing in love and justice,
mm,
helping, healing, liberating, and sharing. I think we
mm,
can find that in every line of work. These days, I think some of you know, I started volunteering to coach
Mhm.
the local Adventist fifth or eighth grade girls basketball team. And so sometimes I go in Sunday and it's all dark and I go in and, open the lights and um but the person is always there when I arrive and when I leave is the school janitor. I think some of you might know Mr. Victor. And I heard he's retiring after this year.
mm,
And for me, he's a good example of someone I think that shows just any line of work you can become a minister of God and have him
mm,
do that work for you because he embodies that. He's a humble, unassuming man, but I feel the presence of God in him and through his work. The way
mm,
he faithfully attends to every detail and the way that he goes above and beyond just his simple job requirements. and it shows. I think he has a respect and admiration of all the students and staff and teachers there.
Mm,
And so it's just a reminder to me that no matter how mm, menial or maybe sometimes meaningless or rote work may seem to me, um, if if I could just remember this, that um, God is my kingdom. You know,
mm.
he's my ruler. He's the force behind everything, behind the birth process, behind life, and behind the blood running through my veins.
Mm.
Then I can be a part of that, and I can effectively through work become His work.
I like that. I like that. For me, I think my point is follows on from that quite simply that every space that God invites us into is an opportunity for us to expand his kingdom. We think it's just sometimes about the vocation,
Mhm.
or so much more than the vocation, because whilst engaged in the vocation, you will naturally develop relationships who are in that space for a reason. People of all kinds of different beliefs and thoughts and whatever it is, people who need relationship just as much as you. And I'm biased, obviously. I'm a pastor, so therefore my work essentially is characterized by the church. And one of the things that I really try to push against is the notion that the church is a space on Sabbath between 9:30 and 2, whatever it is your church times. That's not church to me. Church has always been present and in session outside of the walls of that Sabbath. It's it's the church are the people, and the church go to work every single week through their vocation. So the church is present down at the gas station, the church is present at the school, the church is present, with the janitor, the church is so broad and in so many different locations. It's in session constantly. And it's those relationships of building kingdom. It's the interactions. Peterson reminded me of the fact that it's such an active relational thing, um, and not just some kind of religious rote
Mhm.
cog in the system, so to speak, thing. And so, yeah, I thought that was definitely quite powerful. This comes to the end of our conversation today. We could probably talk a bit more about things, but we will end here and we will move on to chapter 10 next week, on a happier note. The title is called Happiness. And so we will be discussing chapter 10 next week. This has been Pages to Progress. You've been in conversation with myself, Pastor Sam. We've got Darlene, we got James, and we've got John, and we will see you next week. God bless you. Take care. Bye.